Story number 1. The Whispering Doll. It was just a doll, a porcelain face, hollow eyes that never seemed to blink, a dusty, delicate dress. It came to Clara from her grandmother's attic, wrapped in an old, faded blanket. Her grandmother had passed away the month before, and her house had to be cleared out. The doll was tucked away like a secret, a thing long forgotten. Clara held it in her hands, looking at the way the sunlight bounced off the smooth skin of the doll's face. It seemed almost lifelike. She didn't know why, but there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't the kind of thing kids her age would play with. It wasn't even the kind of thing most people would call cute. But her grandmother had kept it for years, so it must have meant something. She placed it on her shelf that night, sitting it next to her stuffed animals and the framed photos of her family. It would be a good way to remember her grandmother. She said goodbye to the room and tucked herself under the covers, the night stretching out, endless and quiet. But then came the whisper. It was faint, like a distant voice, just on the edge of her hearing. She frowned and shifted in bed, straining to hear it. The room was still. Her lamp cast soft light against the walls, shadows dancing in time with the quiet hum of the house. She didn't move, didn't breathe. But the whisper came again, louder this time, almost like a murmur, like someone sitting in the dark, whispering secrets just for her. Clara sat up, her heart racing. She blinked into the dim light. The doll. It was the doll. She stared at it for a long time, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, the house creaking. But no, the whisper was real. It came from the doll, her grandmother's doll. She took a step closer, the cold floor under her feet sending shivers up her spine. The doll sat motionless, its empty eyes staring into nothing, its porcelain skin gleaming in the half-light. Clara's fingers hovered over it. She reached out, her hand trembling. The whisper came again, clearer now, louder. "Help me." Clara jerked her hand back as if she'd touched something electric. She stared at the doll, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was just a doll, a stupid, old doll, but it wasn't just a doll, was it? The whispers kept coming. Soft at first, like a lullaby, but growing more insistent with each passing night. "Help me," it said. "Take me home." Clara couldn't sleep. She couldn't think. The doll haunted her, its empty gaze always following her. Always there, always waiting. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to this doll than a simple gift from her grandmother. She began to research, the old family history coming up dark and twisted. Her grandmother had lived a long life, but before she had become the sweet old woman Clara remembered, there were rumors. Things whispered behind closed doors. People speaking in hushed tones about strange rituals, dark arts, and an old curse. Clara didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. But the whispers weren't stopping. Desperate, Clara visited the old woman's journals, ones she'd kept hidden in a drawer. And there it was. A ritual, a binding, a name written in ink that looked like it was bleeding into the paper, a soul trapped, a spirit bound to the doll. Her grandmother had done it. She had used the doll to trap something, to keep it contained. But now, years later, the doll had found its way to Clara, and it was calling to her. It needed her. It wanted to be free. "Help me." Clara could feel it, the weight of it pressing on her chest. The doll was no longer just a doll. It was the spirit. It was the curse. The very essence of the thing trapped inside it was trying to break free, and Clara was the key. She had to destroy it. She had to end it before it consumed her, before the whispers took her too. With shaking hands, Clara gathered the strength to grab the doll. She could feel its coldness, its energy pulsing through the porcelain. She whispered to it one last time. "I'm not going to help you." The whisper died down, just for a moment, before the doll's eyes seemed to flash with something dark, something ancient. Clara threw it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. The last thing she heard before it burned away was a whisper, one final, desperate plea. "Don't leave me." But by then, Clara was too far gone, and the doll was nothing more than ashes in the fire. Story number 2. The Doll in the Attic. The house was old, not old in the charming vintage way. No, it was the kind of old that made you wonder if maybe someone had left the lights off for a reason. The floors creaked in the wrong places. The air always felt like it was holding its breath. But it was the house they could afford, so they moved in. Lena, Derek, and their 2 kids, Max and Ellie. They didn't mind the dusty smell at first, the thick layer of forgotten history coating everything. It felt like they were stepping into someone else's life, like the house was asking them to stay. They made it work, Lena with her new plants, Derek with his tools, the kids running through the halls, imagining their own stories. It was all so normal, until they found the attic. It was an afterthought, really, a place forgotten by time. The attic door creaked when Derek pulled it open, the hinges protesting as though they were still alive. The staircase was steep, narrow, and the light at the top of the stairs flickered like it didn't want to reveal what was hidden up there. The boxes in the attic were old, wrapped in yellowing paper, some of them sealed tight, others half open, their contents spilling out. Old books, weathered furniture, strange knickknacks, things that didn't belong to them. But then Max found it. He was the first to notice the doll. It was tucked into a corner, wedged between 2 heavy boxes like it had been left there on purpose. It was a porcelain doll, its eyes unnervingly lifelike, like they could see right through you. The painted lips were cracked, the dress a pale shade of blue, its lace frayed at the edges. But what really made it unsettling was how it sat, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting. Max, only 6, didn't seem to mind how wrong it felt. He picked it up, cradling it in his small arms like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Look, Mom," he said, his voice excited. "I found a friend." Lena looked at the doll, a chill running up her spine, but she smiled, brushing it off. "Put it down, Max." We don't know where that's been, but it didn't matter. Max carried the doll everywhere. He didn't put it down at bedtime, or when he played outside. The doll was always with him. And that's when things started to change. It was subtle at first. A door that used to stay closed, now slightly ajar when they came home. A lamp flickering on and off without cause. The house creaked more, almost like it was breathing, and the air felt heavier, thicker, like something was watching. Lena would find Max sitting in the living room, his wide eyes staring at the doll, talking softly to it in a language she couldn't understand. At first, she thought he was just playing, making up stories, but the whispers grew darker, like a hum just beneath the surface. Derek didn't believe it. He was practical. He checked the house, tightened the hinges on the doors, adjusted the lights. But no matter what he did, the strange occurrences kept happening. He would find objects out of place, his keys missing from the kitchen counter, his shoes moved from where he had left them. And Max started to change. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He wouldn't talk to Lena as much. He'd stare at the doll for hours, holding it so tightly his knuckles turned white. And the doll? It wasn't any better. The eyes, those hollow eyes, followed them, watched them. And sometimes, just sometimes, they seemed to move, ever so slightly, when no one was looking. It wasn't long before the others began to notice it too. Derek swore he saw the doll on the floor one morning when it should have been on the shelf. And Lena found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her room filled with the sound of creaking wood and soft whispers, like someone was just outside the door. "Max," she asked one evening, her voice trembling, "where's the doll?" He looked up at her, his face pale, the doll clutched to his chest. "It talks to me," he said in a small voice. "It tells me things." Lena's heart sank. She took a step back, but Max didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on hers, and in that moment she realized something. The doll wasn't just a toy. It wasn't just a forgotten heirloom. It was something else. Something dark, something old that had been awakened. The whispers grew louder. The walls seemed to vibrate with them. Max wasn't just carrying the doll anymore. It had become part of him. And Lena realized, too late, that it wasn't Max who had been controlling the doll. The doll was controlling him. Desperate, Lena tried to get rid of it, throwing the doll into the fireplace one night. But when they woke up the next morning, it was back on the shelf, waiting. The doll was never gone. It never left. It was part of the house now, part of them, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape it. The doll had found its place in the attic, but it had also found its way into their lives, into their souls. By the time they realized what they were dealing with, it was too late. Max was different now, too quiet, too still. The doll's eyes had changed again, even more lifelike, more knowing, more hungry. Lena and Derek could feel it. They knew that there was no leaving the house now. The doll had them, all of them, and it was never going to let them go. Story number 3. The Doll Maker's Revenge. The town had always known the doll maker. Old, mysterious, and strange in ways that most people couldn't put into words, he lived alone in a creaky house at the edge of town. His workshop, a small building tucked behind his home, was filled with dolls. Hundreds of them. Each one was a work of art, so lifelike that it was unsettling to look at them for too long. The townsfolk avoided the house, whispering about the doll maker's talent, but also about something darker that seemed to surround him. No one really knew the truth, not until after he was gone. When the news came that he had been found dead in his workshop, no one was particularly surprised. The doll maker had been old, his health had been failing for years, but his final creation, the one he had worked on in secret, was another matter. It was a doll unlike any other, beautifully crafted, dressed in intricate clothes with porcelain skin that shimmered under the light. The doll was sitting quietly in the corner of the workshop, untouched, as though it had been waiting for something. The townspeople didn't talk much about the doll. They left it there in the workshop, with the old man's body, never to be disturbed. But word got out. And when a wealthy collector heard about it, he knew he had to have it. The doll would be the centerpiece of his collection, the most prized possession in his vast mansion. He didn't think twice. He bought the doll and had it delivered to his home, a cold smile playing on his lips as he thought about how his friends would envy him. The doll arrived in a large wooden crate wrapped in delicate cloth. The collector carefully unwrapped it, admiring the craftsmanship, but something made his skin prickle. He couldn't quite place it, but there was something wrong about the doll. He set it up in a chair by the window, gazing out at the mansion's sprawling grounds. It was perfect. Too perfect. The collector shrugged off the uneasy feeling and went about his day, but that night things started to change. At first, it was small things. Doors creaking open when they should have been closed. A chill running through the house that no amount of heat could seem to chase away. But the most unsettling part was the doll. When the collector would glance at it, he could swear its eyes were no longer staring out the window but following him. He would turn quickly, thinking it was just his imagination. But each time he looked back, the doll seemed closer, as though it had moved on its own. He tried to ignore it, but it became impossible. The doll was everywhere. In the kitchen, sitting at the table as if waiting for him. In the hallway, just outside his bedroom, staring with those unsettling eyes. The house was changing too. The walls seemed to close in and the air became thick, suffocating. The collector's once beautiful home was turning into a twisted reflection of the doll maker's own life. The doll wasn't just a doll, it was something else, a vessel. The collector began to understand, with growing horror, that the doll was not only alive, it was angry. The spirit of the doll maker, vengeful and determined, had somehow been bound to the doll, and it was coming for him. Every night the doll grew closer. Its hands, once delicately folded, were now reaching out, its fingers curling as if it were trying to grab him. The collector's once pristine mansion now felt like a nightmare. The walls began to warp, the floors creaking beneath his feet as if the house itself was alive, feeding off the doll maker's rage. The rooms twisted and contorted into grotesque versions of themselves, mirroring the doll maker's own tormented life. One night, the collector awoke to find the doll standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes wide open and staring. It was no longer just a doll, it had become something much worse. The doll maker's spirit had taken full control, and it was time for the collector to pay for his greed. With a final, chilling whisper, the doll maker's voice echoed in the collector's mind. "You took my last creation. Now you will join me." The doll took a step forward, and the house, once a place of grandeur and wealth, began to crumble. The walls bled with shadows. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. The collector tried to scream, but no sound came. His body grew cold as the doll maker's spirit wrapped around him, pulling him into the twisted nightmare he had created. In the morning, the mansion was still. The doll sat quietly in the chair by the window, its eyes staring out over the grounds. And though the house was empty, if you listened closely enough, you could hear whispers. Whispers of a doll maker's revenge. Story number 4. The Girl in the Dollhouse. Ella hadn't been back to her childhood home in years. Not since she left for college, and then life took her to cities far away, places where she could forget the tight, suffocating air of the house and the memories that came with it. But when the call came, her mother had passed. It felt like the house called her back too. She arrived to find the house as she remembered, even though it felt somehow smaller, more cramped now. The walls, once bright and welcoming, were worn down, the paint chipped. The rooms were silent, filled with the ghosts of a life long gone. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood lingered in the corners. Ella wasn't sure why she had come back. Grief, maybe. Or maybe just to make sure she could leave for good this time. But as she started going through her mother's things, it became clear she had come back to face something. The house had a way of pulling you in, of making you remember things you'd rather forget. In the attic, tucked away in the corner, Ella found it, the dollhouse. She hadn't thought about it in years, not since she was a little girl. The house had always been there, hidden away in the attic, a perfect replica of the home she grew up in. It had been her favorite thing back then, but her mother had always warned her to stay away from it, saying it was too real for someone her age. Ella had never understood why, but after her mother passed, the house felt like it held secrets she couldn't avoid anymore. The dollhouse was pristine, untouched, its tiny windows and doors shining in the dim light of the attic. It was a perfect miniature of the house she had grown up in. Every room was exactly as she remembered, down to the tiniest details. The faded floral wallpaper, the chipped table in the kitchen, the worn-out armchair by the fireplace. But something felt wrong. The air around it felt too still, too heavy. As she leaned in closer, her heart skipped a beat. Inside the dollhouse, there was a doll that hadn't been there before. It was a miniature version of herself. The doll was dressed exactly like her, with her childhood clothes and her brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. It sat in one of the rooms of the dollhouse, perfectly still. Ella stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't put it there, and she hadn't seen it before. The longer she stared at it, the more unsettling it became. The doll looked too lifelike, almost as if it were watching her. Ella took a step back, feeling the weight of her past pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced with questions. Who had put the doll there? Why did it look like her? Then something strange happened. The doll moved. It wasn't a large movement, just a shift, a twitch of the head, but it was enough to send a chill down Ella's spine. She leaned in closer, her eyes fixed on the tiny figure inside the house. It moved again, and this time, it was deliberate. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as the doll turned its head to face her. The small, lifeless eyes seemed to lock onto hers, and for a moment, everything else in the attic disappeared. It was as if time had frozen. The house, the room, the dust, all of it faded away. All that was left was the doll. In a flash, Ella understood. The dollhouse wasn't just a toy, it wasn't a memory or a trinket, it was something far darker. It was a portal. A doorway into the past she had tried so hard to forget. The doll's hand moved now, slowly reaching out from the miniature chair it sat in, as if beckoning her. And Ella, too frightened to move, watched as the doll began to shift its position. Standing up, one tiny foot moving carefully onto the floor of the dollhouse. "Don't," Ella whispered to herself, but it was too late. The room around her seemed to shift, the walls of the attic growing larger, the floor beneath her feet tilting at an odd angle. The dollhouse wasn't just a miniature, it was alive, and it was pulling her in. The doll stepped forward, its tiny foot crossing the threshold of the room in the dollhouse. And in that instant, Ella felt a cold hand on her shoulder, followed by a sharp tug at her chest. Something was trying to pull her into the house, into the world where the spirits of her past lived. The forgotten memories, the people she had left behind, they were all waiting for her to join them. She reached out, her hands trembling, but before she could touch the doll, the world around her blurred. The air grew thick, and the whispers of her childhood, of her mother, of the secrets she'd buried, began to fill the room. The walls closed in, the attic disappearing entirely, and as Ella was pulled into the dollhouse, she realized with terrifying clarity that she had never truly left the house. The house had always been inside her, always waiting, and now it was taking her back to where she had always belonged. Story number 5. The Doll's Eyes. When Nathan's great-aunt passed away, he didn't think much of the things she left behind. Old furniture, dusty books, and trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum were scattered throughout her house. But there was one item that stood out. A doll. It wasn't like the ones you'd find in stores. It was old, far older than anything Nathan had ever seen. The porcelain face was cracked in places, and the body had yellowed with age. Its clothes were tattered, and its hair, though once golden, now looked limp and lifeless. The doll sat in an antique rocking chair, tucked away in a corner of his aunt's house, like it had always been there, watching everything. His parents thought it was a strange relic, a family heirloom that should be kept. They told Nathan to take it home, to keep it for the family. At first, he didn't think twice. It wasn't the kind of thing he'd normally want, but it was something from his family's past, and his aunt had been the last one to own it. He put the doll on his shelf when they got back home, not sure what to do with it. It felt strange, like it didn't belong. But life went on. He'd forget about it for days, until he'd glance at it and feel the oddest sensation. The doll's eyes. They were always looking at him. No matter where he was in the room, no matter what he was doing, he could feel them on him. It started slow, subtle. A glance over his shoulder when he was walking by. A feeling of being watched when he'd turn back to see the doll sitting perfectly still, its eyes locked in his direction. Nathan would shake it off, thinking it was just his imagination. But the longer he lived with the doll, the more real it all felt. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the way he could sometimes hear whispers when no one was around. The way his thoughts seemed to drift and go somewhere else, like they were being pulled away. One night, it all changed. Nathan was lying in bed, the lights dim, the house quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. The shadows in his room seemed to stretch, twisting and dancing on the walls. His eyes flickered to the shelf, to the doll sitting there. The eyes were staring back at him, wide and unblinking. It wasn't the first time, but this time something felt different. The sensation wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was an invasion. His thoughts, his very mind, felt like it wasn't entirely his own. The doll wasn't just watching him, it was inside his head. He sat up, his heart pounding. He could hear a soft voice, faint and barely audible at first, like a whisper that came from deep within the doll. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was like it knew him, like it was speaking directly to him. "You can't escape," it said. "You never could." Panic rose in his chest. He wanted to turn on the light, to look away, to shake the feeling. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed, locked in place, staring at the doll as its eyes seemed to pierce deeper into him. Nathan's thoughts were no longer his own. They were tangled up with something older, something darker. It was like the doll had always been a part of his family, and it had always been watching, waiting. It wasn't just a doll, it was a curse, passed down through the generations, silently tethering each soul to it. The next day, he couldn't shake the feeling. His mind was clouded with thoughts he didn't remember having. His actions felt disconnected, like he wasn't fully in control. He went to the library, desperate for answers. What was this thing? Why did it feel so wrong? As he dug into his family's past, the truth started to unravel. His great-aunt had never just collected dolls. She had kept them, each one a part of a dark ritual, a piece of something much older and far more sinister. The doll Nathan now owned had been the first in the collection, crafted by an ancestor who had made a deal with a dark entity. Each doll was a vessel, holding the souls of those who had died within the family. The curse was passed down through generations, with each new heir forced to take the doll and carry its burden. And Nathan was next. The curse didn't just bind the family to the doll, it bound their very souls. Every time someone died, their soul was trapped inside one of the dolls, and their consciousness was absorbed into the doll's unblinking gaze. His aunt hadn't died by accident. She had known the curse was coming for her, and the doll had slowly consumed her, just as it had done with every ancestor before her. The whispers in his head grew louder. "You're next, Nathan," they said. "Your soul will join ours." Nathan ran home, his mind racing with panic. He had to get rid of it. He had to destroy the doll before it was too late. But when he reached his room, the doll was waiting for him. Its eyes locked onto his with a cold, relentless stare. It was too late. As he reached out to touch it, A cold chill spread through his body, freezing him in place. He could feel his soul being pulled, slowly at first, but then faster, as if the doll had already started to claim him. The last thing Nathan heard was a voice, not from his own mind, but from the doll's mouth, whispering with a twisted, satisfied tone, "Welcome home." And then, everything went dark. Story number 6. The Doll Who Never Sleeps. When Claire and Tom bought the antique doll at the yard sale, they didn't think twice. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and they had been out browsing, looking for something interesting to decorate their home. The doll was old, with an antique dress and carefully braided hair. Its porcelain face was cracked in places, but the eyes, those eyes, seemed strangely real. But Claire, always the more sentimental one, saw something charming about it. "It's just an old doll," she said, holding it up for Tom to see. "Perfect for the guest room." Tom didn't share her enthusiasm. "It's creepy," he muttered. But it was only $1, and Claire was persistent. They took it home, placed it on a small wooden chair by the window, and forgot about it for a while. The first night, everything seemed fine. They went to bed as usual, the house silent except for the occasional creak of old floors. But in the middle of the night, Claire woke up. At first, it was just a flicker of noise, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the guest room, where the doll sat. She lay there for a moment, listening. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind rattling the windows. But no, it came again, the scratching, like fingernails dragging along the floor. Claire nudged Tom. "Do you hear that?" Tom grumbled in his sleep, rolling over. "It's nothing. Go back to sleep." But Claire couldn't. She lay there, wide awake, straining to hear. The scratching continued, growing louder. It felt wrong, like something was moving in the dark. The next morning, Tom dismissed it. "You probably dreamed it. The house is old, it's just the wood." Claire tried to let it go, but the scratching kept coming back. Every night, like a clock ticking, it would begin just after midnight. Sometimes it was light, barely noticeable. Other nights, it was loud enough to make her skin crawl. Then, one evening, she came home from work early and found the doll in a different position. It had been facing the window when they left, but now it was turned toward the door, staring directly into the room. "Tom!" Claire called, her voice tight. "Did you move the doll?" Tom came into the room, looked at the doll and shrugged. "No, why would I move it?" Claire frowned, her heart racing. "It wasn't like this before. I'm telling you, something is wrong with it." But Tom only shook his head. "You're imagining things. It's just a doll, Claire." That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It was frantic, like something was trying to get out of the room. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. She crept into the guest room, her heart pounding in her chest. The doll was still sitting in the chair, but this time she noticed something different. Its eyes. The eyes were no longer empty. They were wide open, fixed on her, as if they were alive. "Tom!" she screamed, running to the door. "Come here, now!" Tom rushed in, annoyed, but when he saw the doll, his face fell. The eyes, those eyes, were looking right at him, too. "This isn't possible," he muttered, stepping closer. And then, in a voice that wasn't theirs, a low whisper seeped from the doll's cracked mouth. "Leave. Leave this place." Claire froze, her blood running cold. Tom didn't move, his expression frozen in shock. The doll's eyes narrowed, as if it were studying them. Then the voice returned, softer, but clearer. "I can feel you. You're both here, trapped with me. Your souls belong to me now." Tom stepped back, his face pale. This isn't happening." But Claire was already shaking. "It's alive, Tom. It's been alive all along." The days that followed only worsened. The doll seemed to grow more powerful. It began to speak more often, the voice crawling into their minds. At night, it would scratch at the walls. Its presence felt everywhere. Sometimes Claire would find herself drawn to the doll as if it was pulling her closer. One afternoon, while Tom was at work, Claire started to look deeper into the doll's past. She found an old newspaper article from years ago, detailing the story of a young girl who had once owned the doll. The girl had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the doll had vanished with her. After that, the doll had been passed down through various families, each one facing strange, terrifying occurrences until the doll was sold off at the yard sale, its curse moving with it. The voice returned that night. "I told you, you belong to me." Claire couldn't take it any longer. The doll was taking over their lives, feeding on their fear, on their souls. It was as if it was trying to twist them into something else, something darker. In a desperate attempt to get rid of it, Claire tried to burn the doll, but the flames wouldn't touch it. It sat there, watching her, as if it was mocking her attempts. Tom finally broke down, his face pale with terror. "What do we do, Claire?" She couldn't answer him. There was no escaping it. The doll, the voice, the presence, it was all too powerful. That night, they both lay awake, unable to sleep, as the scratching began again. It grew louder and louder, until it wasn't just coming from the guest room anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The doll never sleeps. It waits, always watching, always listening. And now, Claire and Tom know the truth. They are no longer its owners. They are its prisoners. Forever. Story number 7. The Doll's Curse. Mara had never been a superstitious person. She'd never believed in ghosts or curses or anything like that. So when she spotted the doll at the thrift store, she didn't think twice about it. It was old, a little worn, with a chipped face and an empty socket where one of its eyes should have been. But for some reason, when her eyes met its empty gaze, she felt an intense pull, an unexplainable attachment. It was just a doll, after all. She bought it on a whim, feeling silly the whole time as she walked home with it cradled in her arms. She placed it on a shelf in her living room next to her other little trinkets. It seemed harmless enough, but from the moment she set it down, something felt off. The next morning, Mara woke up to find bruises on her arms, deep purple and tender. She couldn't remember how they'd gotten there, but she chalked it up to clumsiness. Maybe she'd bumped into something in the night. But the bruises kept coming. Each day, there were more, smaller ones, larger ones. They appeared overnight, like the doll was marking her, leaving its signature behind. And soon, it wasn't just the bruises. There were strange accidents. She tripped over nothing, stumbled into doorways, and scraped her arms on sharp corners. Every time it happened, she'd glance at the doll, its one good eye staring at her like it was watching her every move. The nightmares started shortly after that. At first, they were just vague, half-formed dreams. But each night they grew more vivid. She'd dream of being in a dark house, hearing footsteps behind her, feeling a cold presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sometimes she'd wake up in a cold sweat, the scent of something old and musty lingering in the air. Mara couldn't take it anymore. She'd always been practical, always believed that things happened for a reason. But this was different. She felt like something was coming for her, something she couldn't see but could feel in the pit of her stomach. And it all seemed to trace back to the doll. One afternoon, in a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, Mara visited the local library. There was a historian in town, an old man who seemed to know everything about the town's strange and forgotten history. She figured if anyone knew about the doll, it would be him, He listened carefully to her story, his eyes growing darker with each word she spoke. "That doll," he said slowly, "is not just a doll. It's part of a cursed set, one that's been passed down for generations. Anyone who owns it becomes its target, pulled into a web of misfortune and death." Mara blinked, feeling a chill run through her. "A curse? Are you serious?" The historian nodded. The doll was crafted many years ago by a man who dabbled in the dark arts. He made a set of dolls, each one meant to trap a soul. They were supposed to be a gift for someone he loved, but the curse backfired. The spirit he tried to bind into the dolls was vengeful. It wanted to destroy him, and anyone who owned the dolls after that. Mara's stomach turned. "What does it want with me?" The historian shook his head. "It feeds on pain. It feeds on the fear and suffering of the one who owns it. The more you suffer, the stronger it becomes. And it won't stop until it's taken everything from you." Mara felt the room spin. She couldn't breathe. All the strange accidents, the injuries, the nightmares, they all started to make sense. The doll wasn't just a trinket, it was a parasite, feeding off her life. And it had been waiting for her. She left the library in a daze, the weight of the curse pressing down on her chest. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, made her heart race. The doll, she could feel its presence even from the other side of the room. It was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She tried to get rid of it. She locked it in the closet, wrapped it in blankets, but every time she turned her back, the doll was back on the shelf, sitting there like nothing had happened. Its one good eye still staring at her, unblinking. The accidents became more frequent. One night, as Mara was walking through the kitchen, she slipped on a puddle of water she didn't remember spilling, crashing into the counter and cutting her hand on the sharp edge. Blood dripped onto the floor, staining the tiles. She looked down at the doll, sitting on the shelf, and heard the faintest whisper, so faint she wasn't sure if it was in her head or if the doll was actually speaking. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice cold and empty. "It's time." Mara felt herself drawn to the doll, like it had a hold on her. Her legs moved without her permission, her heart pounding in her chest. She was helpless against the pull, and as she reached out to touch it, the lights flickered. Her body went numb. The world around her spun, and the doll's one good eye seemed to shine with malevolent intent. Mara knew in that moment that the curse had claimed her. There was no escape now. The doll's curse had her, and it wasn't letting go. Story number 8. The Doll of Echoes. The house was old, like something straight out of a storybook. It had creaky floors, sagging walls, and a history that seemed too heavy to ignore. The kind of house that made you wonder what had happened there before, but nobody ever spoke about it. It was the kind of house that seemed to have a pulse, a rhythm to it that you could almost feel in your bones. When the Collins family moved in, they had no idea what they were walking into. They were looking for a fresh start, something quiet, somewhere they could finally settle down. But the town had secrets, and the house, well, it had more than its fair share. Their daughter, Lily, was the first to notice something strange. It was in the attic, buried beneath dusty old boxes, forgotten furniture and forgotten memories. The doll. It was small, almost fragile, with a cracked porcelain face and frayed clothes. It looked like something from another time, another place, an era long gone. Lily picked it up without thinking, immediately feeling a connection. It felt warm in her hands, as if it had been waiting for her. She carried it downstairs and set it in her room, placing it carefully on a shelf. For a few days, nothing happened. The house settled into its usual rhythm, quiet and empty, save for the sound of footsteps on the old wooden floors. But as Lily began to play with the doll, strange things started happening. At first, it was just her voice, the words she spoke, but they didn't sound like her own. They were higher, softer, and they seemed to echo in the corners of her room. "Lily, who are you talking to?" Her mother, Sarah, called from downstairs. Lily looked up, confused. She hadn't been talking, or at least she hadn't meant to. She sat there for a moment, trying to shake the odd feeling creeping up her spine, but shrugged it off. She was just playing with her new doll. There was nothing to worry about, right? But it wasn't long before it happened again. The next evening, as Lily sat on the floor, cradling the doll, she began to speak. Only it wasn't her voice this time. It was a deep, hollow voice, the kind that sent a shiver through the air. "They never should have left," the voice whispered. Lily froze. The words weren't hers. She hadn't spoken them. She wasn't even sure she understood them. The air in the room felt colder, thicker. Something was changing. Sarah rushed up the stairs, her face pale as she saw Lily clutching the doll, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening?" she asked, kneeling beside her daughter. "I didn't say it," Lily stammered, her voice shaking. "It wasn't me." The next night it was worse. Lily's father, Mark, had come home late from work. He found Lily in her room again, but this time she wasn't speaking at all. She was sitting silently, the doll in her lap, her eyes glazed over. Then, suddenly, she began to speak again. But this time, the words were louder, clearer. And they weren't just random phrases. It was as if she was telling a story. "The fire started when they left," the voice said, as though recounting a memory. "The house was already burning when they found us. We never made it out." Mark's heart sank as he listened. He stepped back, looking at Sarah, but she was already on the verge of tears. "What is she saying? What is going on?" It was then that Sarah remembered the stories she had heard about the house. The ones no one wanted to talk about. The fire. The tragedy that had occurred years ago, when the house had belonged to another family. A family that had disappeared, never to be found. The house had burned down, and the only thing that had been left behind was the doll. "Lily," Sarah whispered, sitting beside her daughter, "where did you hear that? Where did those words come from?" But Lily didn't answer. She just kept speaking, the voice now coming from her in a constant stream of words. Words that didn't feel like hers, that didn't belong to her. It was as though the doll was speaking through her, using her to channel the voices of those who had died in the house. As the days passed, the voices grew stronger. Lily no longer seemed like herself. She was still there, but it was as if someone else was inhabiting her. The line between who Lily was and the spirits she channeled began to blur. She would speak with different voices, all of them carrying pain, sorrow, and anger. She spoke of things that hadn't been told, things that the town had buried. "Don't trust the house," one voice warned, its tone full of fear. "It never lets you leave." Lily's parents tried to intervene, but the more they tried to take the doll away, the stronger the connection between Lily and the voices became. It was as if the doll had become part of her, as if it had woven itself into the very fabric of her identity. And then, one night, Lily spoke with the voice of a woman, her voice echoing through the house. "They never made it out," the woman's voice whispered, "but they will. If you stay long enough, they will make you one of them." Lily's eyes met her parents for the first time in days. "They're here," she said softly. "They never left." The house creaked, the walls groaned. The voices, those tragic echoes, were now part of their home, and there was no turning back. The doll had connected them all, and now it would never let them go. Story number 9. The Dollmaker's Lair. Ben had always been a curious man, someone who found himself wandering into forgotten places just to see what lay inside. That's how he found the mansion. It was hidden deep in the woods, so far off the beaten path that it almost felt like the forest had swallowed it whole. The house was old, its windows shattered, the roof caving in, and vines crawling up the walls like they were trying to drag it back into the earth. No one had lived there for years, maybe decades, but something about it called to him. It was like it was waiting, inviting him in. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a dying breath. The air inside was thick with dust and mildew, but there was something else too, something faint, like the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. The house felt like a place stuck between time, frozen in a moment it couldn't escape. Ben stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning beneath his feet. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing the skeleton of the house beneath. He walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence, until he came upon a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the faintest light leaking through the crack. He pushed it open. The room was filled with dolls, hundreds of them, lining the shelves, sitting in chairs, hanging from the ceiling. They were everywhere, old porcelain dolls, wooden figures, and ragged cloth dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. Their eyes, empty, lifeless, seemed to follow Ben as he stepped into the room. Their glassy stares sent a shiver up his spine. But it wasn't just the sheer number of dolls that unnerved him. It was their perfection. The way they looked so real. Some of them were so detailed. He could almost see the subtle movements of their chests, like they were breathing. He shook his head, trying to push the thought out of his mind. They were just dolls after all, just toys. But the room felt heavy, suffocating, like it was watching him. At the far end of the room, there was one doll that stood out. It was larger than the rest, sitting alone on a pedestal in the center. Its clothes were elegant, its face more detailed than the others. But what made it stand apart was the way it seemed to call to him. Ben couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to it, like it was beckoning him. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared the doll, he noticed something strange. Its eyes, those glassy, lifeless eyes, were fixed on him. But there was something different about them. They weren't just empty, they were full of something. A longing, a desperation. It felt like the doll was alive, and it wanted him to notice. Suddenly, Ben felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He reached out a hand, almost involuntarily, and touched the doll's face. The moment his fingers brushed against the porcelain, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in. The dolls, hundreds of them, began to move. Ben pulled his hand back in shock. The dolls were alive. At first, it was subtle. A slight twitch of a hand, a slight shift in position. But then, the dolls began to move in unison. They started to turn their heads toward him, their eyes following his every movement. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the sound of their stiff limbs creaking as they shifted. Ben stumbled backward, panic rising in his chest. The doll on the pedestal was still staring at him, but now it seemed to grin, a twisted, jagged smile that sent a wave of nausea through him. He ran. He bolted from the room, but the dolls were already following him. They moved faster than he thought possible, their wooden limbs creaking, their glassy eyes filled with an unnatural hunger. Ben could hear them behind him, the sound of their footsteps. Quick, relentless, like they were gaining on him. He ran through the house, not knowing where he was going, but needing to get away. The dolls were everywhere now. They were in the hallways, on the stairs, spilling out of the rooms, their heads tilted to one side as if they were studying him, trying to figure out where he was going next. In his frantic search for an escape, Ben stumbled into a dusty study. On the desk was an old book, its cover worn and cracked. He didn't have time to read it, but he flipped it open, desperate for any clue. The pages were filled with drawings of dolls, all similar to the ones in the house. And then he saw it. A diagram of a man, a doll, and a description that made his stomach drop. The doll maker. A man obsessed with capturing souls in his creations. A man who believed that by trapping a soul in the body of a doll, he could live forever. The doll that Ben had touched was the last in a collection, each one containing the soul of its former owner. The dolls weren't just dolls. They were the trapped spirits of the dead, and now they were after him. Ben slammed the book shut, his heart racing. He had to get out. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of him. The dolls were closing in. He could hear them now, voices, faint at first, but growing louder. "You're next," they whispered, their voices like a chorus of the dead. "You will never leave." The walls shook. The dolls were coming for him, faster than ever, their lifeless eyes glowing with malice. Ben tried to run, but he was surrounded, trapped in a sea of porcelain and wood. And as the dolls closed in, Ben realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't leaving the mansion. Not alive, not ever. The doll maker's creations had claimed him, and they would never stop. Story number 10. The Doll and the Door. Samantha and Jake had always liked antiques. They enjoyed the odd, quirky finds at estate sales, and when they stumbled upon the doll, they thought it would be a fun addition to their new home. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just an old porcelain doll with a delicate lace dress and bright blue eyes. But there was something about it that intrigued them, something that felt different. They bought it on a whim, placing it carefully on a shelf in their living room. It seemed harmless enough, just another oddity among their collection of vintage furniture and trinkets. But soon after they brought the doll inside, things started to change. At night, they began to notice something strange. The doll seemed to glow faintly, its porcelain skin flickering with a soft, eerie light. Samantha would glance at it from across the room, her heart racing as she saw the faintest shimmer in the doll's eyes. It was as though the doll was alive, watching them from its perch. But every time she turned to get a closer look, the glow would fade, leaving only the stillness of the room behind. The first real oddity came the next day. Jake was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. The doll, which had been sitting perfectly still on the shelf, was now on the floor at the foot of the stairs. He froze for a moment, wondering if he had somehow knocked it down earlier. But no, he hadn't touched it. He went to pick it up, but as his hand brushed the doll's cold porcelain, a chill ran through him. "It's like it moved on its own," Jake said, his voice low. Samantha laughed it off, but her nerves were starting to fray. "It's just a doll. You're imagining things." But Jake wasn't so sure. That night, when they went to bed, the strange occurrences continued. The doll began to appear in different places around the house, always somewhere it shouldn't be. One morning, it was in the bathroom. Another time, it was sitting on the kitchen table, staring at them with those unsettling blue eyes. Things took a darker turn when they tried to leave the house. It started with small things, Samantha heading out to grab groceries, but then finding herself inexplicably back at the front door. She'd open the door again, only to find herself standing right back where she started. Jake thought it was just a trick of the mind. But then, it happened to him too. No matter how many times they tried to leave, they always ended up back at the front door. It wasn't just the door, though. As they spent more time in the house, the feeling of being trapped grew stronger. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken pressure that pushed against them. And through it all, the doll was watching. It was always there, its eyes gleaming in the corner of their vision, always moving closer, always shifting. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Jake stood in front of the doll, a feeling of dread crawling up his spine. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why can't we leave?" The doll didn't answer, but something in the room shifted. The air grew colder, and for a split second Jake could have sworn the doll's eyes blinked. He stepped back, his heart pounding. The lights flickered and the house seemed to groan, as though it were alive, aware of their presence. Samantha, who had been standing in the doorway, suddenly cried out, "Jake, look, the door, it's different." He turned to see that the front door had changed. The wood was warped, the paint peeling, but what was worse was the darkness beyond it. It wasn't the world outside, it was just more house. The outside world was gone, replaced by a hallway that looked exactly like the one behind them. "We're stuck," Samantha whispered, her face pale with fear. "It's the doll. It's the key to this, whatever this is." They realized then that the doll wasn't just a doll. It was a part of something far older, a curse that had bound them to the house. The house wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, and the doll was its anchor. Every time they tried to leave, the house pushed them back, as though it had a claim on them. The doll had somehow become a part of a dark ritual, a trap for the souls of those who dared to step inside. They spent the next few days searching for a way to break free, but the more they looked into the history of the house, the more they discovered that no one had ever left. The mansion had been abandoned for years, but before that, it had been the site of strange rituals, performed by those who had lived there long ago. Each ritual had been tied to a doll, each one binding a soul to the house for eternity. The doll was the final piece in the puzzle, the key that held them captive. The only way to escape was to destroy it, to break the curse that had trapped them there. With trembling hands, Jake took the doll and threw it into the fireplace. But as the flames roared to life, the house shook. The door seemed to warp, the walls trembled, and the air was filled with the sound of whispers, voices from the past, trapped souls crying out for release. And then, everything went dark. When Jake opened his eyes, he was standing at the front door again. The doll was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was silent. The door was wide open, and beyond it, the world seemed to stretch out before them. But when they stepped outside, they both froze. The house wasn't just behind them. It was all around them. The woods, the sky, the ground beneath their feet. It was as if they hadn't left the house at all. They had never left. And in the distance they could see it. The doll, sitting on the porch, waiting for them to come back.